Welcome to the Deep Dive,
Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Deep Dive podcast, Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast. Got some stuff to talk about today, RJ, and I think it's going to be like a good conversation talking about the upcoming Matty contract whenever that's announced in light of the Quinton Byfield extension that he signed with the LA Kings and how that could affect the Matty Beniers situation. We've got a good question in relation to one of our answers from last week that I want to talk about involving Jagger Firkus. A little bit of news to talk about as well, but of course we got to start off talking about the wonderful Queen Anne Beer Hall, the wonderful sponsor of this podcast. And RJ, they got something upcoming for us to promote.
That's right. I mean, it's already pretty late into July here, but look forward to the start of August. August 1st is Brewers Night at Queen Anne Beer Hall. Starts at 5 p.m. And of course, one of the centerpieces of it, the Stein holding competition. I have judged one of these before. It is very difficult. I certainly couldn't do one. I would not last very long, but they have a Stein holding competition right around the corner at Queen Anne Beer Hall. Anyone can enter, and the winner will get 2 round-trip tickets to Oktoberfest in New York City with hotel accommodations. And you can compete in the New York Stein holding competition in Central Park. So you can see how good you are compared to people from potentially all over the country at that one as well. So mark your calendars. It's going to be a great event. Brewers Night is always awesome at Queen Anne Beer Hall.
Yeah, no, that sounds like it would be a lot of fun. And they've got, like pictures on their Instagram from last year, and it looks like a ton of fun. Lots of people there having a good time. So, yeah, definitely go check that out at Queen Anne Beer Hall on August 1st, everybody. And then we have a little thing to promote here before we get into the news, and that is next week's Deep Dive. We're getting this is the new formula, everybody. We start promoting the next podcast at the beginning of this one. But next week we wanted to do our annual write in and tell us your favorite moment from the past Kraken season. This is something we've done each of the last couple off seasons where we've had people message us about their favorite moment. We've talked about our favorite moments from the previous season, and it's always a lot of fun to kind of go back and relive those experiences kind of all together. So looking forward to that one. RJ, how can people reach out to us to tell us their favorite moment from the Kraken season?
Right. So there are a number of ways that you can reach out to us and send us your favorite moment. Via social media, you can DM us at Emerald City HKY on Twitter. You can DM us on Instagram at Emerald City HKY. You can also send us an email, contact@emeraldcityhockey.com. Send an email out to us with that. And that is how you get a hold of us and send us whatever. You can write something. You can send us a little video if you want. You can, send us an audio clip, whatever you want to send us to let us know what your favorite moments are from this past Kraken season. And I've got to say, I love this episode every year. Now it's 3 years that we've done it. So it is our third annual. I think we can call it annual at this point. And just kind of reliving the season that was. And there's always so many great moments, especially things that we sometimes forget that we didn't really think of too, to get to relive those moments.
Right. And all the personal moments too, like it'll be some, just otherwise benign regular season game, but it was the first time, one of you brought a family member to the game and they had a great time, something like that. And I always love hearing those stories as well, because it just means that the Kraken community grows a little bit more. We always get 1 or 2 of those each year, and I love hearing that. So really looking forward to that next week. But I'm also looking forward to right now, RJ, Daniel Sprong coming back to the Pacific Division.
Yes, he is.
Not with the Kraken, unfortunately, but he's going to Vancouver. Your initial thoughts when you first heard Daniel Sprong was coming back to the Pacific Northwest, RJ?
Happy to have him around kind of closer. I don't know. I really miss covering Daniel Sprong. He was always a joy to kind of see in the locker room and cover. So happy for him, because I know he was still out there well into free agency. And so I'm glad he kind of found a team that seemed to want him. So I'm happy for him there. That was my initial thought. But then also thinking, he's going to score against the Kraken this season. He is. I mean, you look at last season, he played 2 games against Seattle because he was with Detroit in the Eastern Conference, scored a goal in one of the games and had an assist in the other one. I just feel like he's going to at least top that production against Seattle this season. You just know he is.
You think he's going to have 3 points in twice as many games against the Kraken he gets to play? Probably.
Yeah, I think you take three. I
Yeah.
think three would be the absolute minimum.
Yeah. So it is an interesting one. Obviously, I know this is going to be tough for all the Kraken fans that still very much like Daniel Sprong. I think this is realistically a good situation for Daniel Sprong in the sense that he gets to slot in kind of more so where he should be in Vancouver than ultimately where he ended up in Detroit. Just because, and I think he's going to fit in well in Rick Tocchet's system. It's a pretty aggressive attack off the rush transitional system. We know Daniel Sprong can handle that. I think he's going to be able to do some good things in Vancouver. Yeah, he was able to land a spot after almost a whole month of free agency kind of going by. It's a 1-year deal. I mean, it's pretty close to league minimum. Like it's under $1 million cap hit. It's he's Daniel Sprong, man. Last year finished with 12 minutes average of ice time. Like, this is what he does.
He does what he does. Like we saw it in Seattle, we saw it in Detroit. He does what he does. He's a bottom six player, but he scores at a ridiculous rate for a bottom six player and doesn't play that well in his own half of the ice. Yeah, we know who Daniel Sprong is, but you know what? At under $1 million, that's a bargain. Like because you use them when you can, you use them when it makes sense, and when it doesn't. I mean, heck, the cap risk is nothing. I mean, that is a variable amount. You can bury that contract in the minors if everything goes horribly, right? And the cap hit is zero to you, so it's really not a problem, even in a worst case scenario for Vancouver. So I think it's a smart signing. And then for Sprong, I think he's going to be used in that bottom six role and kind of play the way he did over the last couple seasons. But also, I saw it pointed out that Besser and Garland are the only other right shots for Vancouver in their top 9. Mm-hmm. And so that potentially gives them a little mobility. Like if something were to happen to Brock Besser, you just slide Sprong up the lineup and there you go. Or Connor Garland.
Yeah, no, it really did make a lot of sense. When I saw it and I looked at Vancouver, I thought, oh, this actually does make a lot of sense for him. And it makes sense for the team as well to add somebody like him. So I don't love that because I don't want Vancouver to be good, but it was a good
situation. Used to them
making
making smart decisions still.
I'm not. It is still weird to see that. He averaged, like I said, exactly 12 minutes of ice time last year. RJ had 160 shots. Care to guess where that would have ranked him on the Kraken last year?
160 shots.
Mr. Volume Shooter Daniel Sprong.
Oh man, say third,
fourth, just behind Jordan Everly, who was third. Yes, so he might not get a lot of ice time, but he really tries to make the most of it. So. Yeah, I guess congrats to Daniel Sprong on getting another gig. I don't like that it seems like it might be a good fit because it's in Vancouver.
I'm still happy for him.
Yeah.
I'll always be happy for him. I hope he has, he finds places that are a good fit because I don't know. It when you see a special player like that, you kind of want it to work out.
Yeah. All right. The other piece of news, this one is like Kraken related, was we had some news kind of come out about Brian Dumoulin and the situation that he was in with the Kraken after the season ended.
That's right. So from this article by Travis Lazarchuk in the Portland Press Herald, he did a good interview with Brian Dumoulin. By the way, I would recommend reading it for those because it kind of gives an insight into how the whole process went at the trade deadline. I mean, at the trade deadline and beyond, really, and through the offseason. Because if you remember, Dylan, at the trade deadline, there were some rumblings that the Kraken might move Dumoulin. And you'd think it would make sense a little bit with Riker Evans on the roster there too. We talked about it, but I think it was reported around the deadline. I think it was Elliot Friedman who reported that, the transition to Seattle had been a little difficult for Dumoulin. And I think this article shed a little bit more light on that. And so this article confirmed that, and I'll quote from it here. Dumoulin said he and his representatives approached Seattle general manager Ron Francis about a trade prior to the NHL draft in late June. They told the club Dumoulin would like to join a team on the East Coast. So Ron Francis, honoring half of that request, I guess, he does trade Brian Dumoulin, but to the Anaheim Ducks, who I don't think anybody would argue are on the East Coast, more so on the West Coast, but still it sheds a little light on kind of that process. And it said later in the article, too, that Francis initially didn't have any plans to trade Dumoulin. That wasn't really something they were looking at. But then, of course, with the free agent signing of Brandon Montour, that meant a defenseman had to go. And so then when you can honor a trade request, you go ahead and do it. So, I mean, what do you think about that kind of new information coming to light? Does this change the way that we look at the Dumoulin trade at all?
It does for me, just because, keep in mind, it came a day after we had literally talked with Ron Francis, and he was like, no, we're good with our 7 guys and we're going to move forward with our 7 guys, and I'm done making moves. And then the very next day, here we go, Brian Dumoulin trade. So it makes a little bit more sense that he was honoring a request, and that the situation arose where he could honor that request without upsetting what the Kraken had going too much. Whereas beforehand at the draft, say, it might have looked a little bit different. And we would have been like, wow, this decor is all of a sudden getting pretty depleted, even with Riker Evans coming up. So it makes a big difference to me. It's unfortunate that the transition maybe to Seattle was a little rough on Dumoulin and his family. Happy that he gets to then go somewhere else if that's what he wanted. I got to think that this is one of those situations where already there's a handshake agreement with Pat Verbeek in Anaheim, where come trade deadline, half of his contract's being retained. He'll be a true rental, and they'll do their best to send him to an Eastern Conference team.
Yeah, you'd have to think so. If Anaheim is in the position in the standings that we think they're going to be around trade deadline time, that would make all the sense in the world, especially on an expiring contract for Dumoulin. So I'm sure Verbeek will try and do right by him, and hoping for the best for Dumoulin there, because it seems like there's smoke and probably fire around the transition being a little difficult for him to Seattle. And that's understandable given that he played over 10 years in Pittsburgh, never knew another NHL team, and then kind of had to move across the country for this. But I will say that, I mean, you could never tell outwardly, right? I mean, right. He was a true pro the whole time. I mean, he did an interview with me on this podcast, right? For the deep dive a few months ago. He was always, fantastic, easy to talk to. Even had the chance to chat with his wife kind of earlier on in the season. And they were definitely trying their best to make everything work. So wishing the best for Brian Dumoulin.
Definitely. So, also only 1 year left on the contract. So I think something will end up happening mid-season, but if not, can kind of go back to the East Coast in the next off season there. Moving on here. So we last episode, we obviously had kind of our mailbag episode, and there was lots of questions, especially around the prospects. And I had floated the idea, as I have for a little while now, of trading Jagger Firkus. And that him coming off the season he just had as he wraps up his WHL career, his value is arguably never been higher than it is right now this offseason, right? Before he starts that transition to the AHL. Don't really know what that's going to end up ultimately looking like for him. He talked at Dev Camp. Kraken head of player development, Tambellini, talked about it at Dev Camp, about all the work he's going to have to put in making that transition to the AHL. His value has never been higher, so I'd floated the idea that you could trade Firkus. I think there was a question even about like which prospects would you trade or something like that. If the Kraken had to trade a prospect, who would it be? Mm-hmm. And so I'd floated Jagger Firkus's name, and somebody left a comment on that episode of the deep dive on YouTube, asking the question of, basically what would we get? Like, okay, you trade Jagger Firkus, like what do you actually get? And comparing it to the Matthew Savoy trade that happened when Buffalo traded Savoy to Edmonton in exchange for Ryan McLeod, and asking, would this be a similar comp to a Firkus trade? And thinking about it, yeah, that's probably a pretty good comp of what this trade would end up being. I do think, RJ, that any trade involving Jagger Firkus, you're trading him and the roll of the dice, the throw at the dartboard, whatever you want to call it, of him becoming an NHLer and whatever kind of NHLer he could be. And in return, you would probably get a very, very good bottom 6 player. Like, that is probably the 1-for-1 deal.
I think that is about right value-wise, and I think that is probably a good comp there. And then you ask the question, though, okay, if that is the deal, if that is kind of the 1-for-1 value comparison, is that still something that you're happy with or would still recommend doing? I don't know about you, Dylan, but for me, let's reverse that Edmonton Buffalo trade, right? But if Edmonton offered a Ryan McLeod for a Jagger Firkus, I'd do that. I don't know about you. I'd do that.
Yeah, I would. Well, I mean, it's complicated because the Kraken roster is so weird right now.
Right, where would you put him?
Yeah, you can't put him anywhere right now, which is probably why we won't see a Jagger Firkus trade this offseason. But if the Kraken were in a slightly different spot, I would do that. I mean, we just saw Ryan McLeod in the postseason for the Edmonton Oilers, what he was able to do all the way up through the Stanley Cup Finals, and what he was able to kind of do there. He was a pretty good depth center for them. Like he was able to step up when they needed him to. He stepped up in the big moments. And I think you take that kind of guaranteed production, NHL production, where you know this guy's going to have a long NHL career, over the dart throw of a guy that there are still fairly serious questions about what his ability is going to be at the NHL level, and how much of his game can kind of translate there. And I think that that's also basically what Buffalo did by trading Savoy for Ryan McLeod, right? Because Savoy, very similar player to Jagger Firkus in the sense that putting up stupid WHL numbers. He was obviously kind of too good for that league. Savoy had already put up good numbers in the AHL for Buffalo, by the way, 5 points in 6 games with the Americans in the AHL for Buffalo. But Buffalo just didn't really seem to have a spot for him on their roster, and didn't really seem to know where he would go. He's had multiple off seasons to make that team. Hasn't. 18-year-old Zach Benson does, though. So like you have to think they were open to it. And I think that's kind of that might end up being the situation with Jagger Firkus, come next offseason, where it's going to be like, where does he really fit in? How much ice time do we actually give him? What situations do we really deploy him in? And you have those kinds of questions. If you're going to end up with a guy who's at best a middle six player anyway, you might as well take the sure thing ahead of time, right. I feel like.
Yeah, and I mean, that's clearly the logic in that trade with Edmonton and Buffalo. I mean, with Savoy, it looked like he actually did translate pretty well to the AHL, and that's where I might have some pause on a player like that, just because I think the learning curve for Jagger Firkus is going to be a lot steeper going to the AHL. And like, look, Tambolini talked about it. Robert Cron talked about it at the draft. Like, it's going to be a bigger learning curve, just given that he didn't really adapt his game a ton at the WHL level. We've talked about this already, though. But I think for the Kraken, though, when we've talked about Jagger Firkus being potentially involved in a trade discussion, right, it's rarely of the 1-for-1 variety. And it's because that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to bring in a depth forward, because the Kraken just don't need that right now. They already have too many forwards. Really, what it would be is him included in a larger trade package to go and get a difference maker.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of deal that I really wouldn't mind seeing him included in, because if you're going to make a deal like that, if you're going to, I mean, these didn't really happen this offseason, but if you're going to go and take a swing for like a Natchez or an Ehlers or somebody that's going to be a high-end difference maker, you're going to have to give up some serious value, and Firkus could be an important part of that value. And that's why you would move him.
Exactly. So I still think I'm with you. That is ultimately the most likely trade scenario involving Jagger Firkus. Otherwise, going to see him in the Valley next year, and we'll see how that transition ends up going for him. And we'll probably,
which I am excited for, by the way. Too. Like, I don't want it to sound like we're not excited for this and that we don't think there's any chance of upside or anything. But yeah, I'm just interested to see how he can do.
Right. I want it to work out. Like dude would be so much fun to watch with the Kraken, and to be a legit NHLer and all of that stuff. Like, I very much want all that stuff to work out. It's just, I don't know. I put on my realist hat maybe a little bit too much. Some would say it's a pessimist hat, maybe. But I just, like I said, I want to see a preseason where he can kind of hang in the preseason action from a physical standpoint. We haven't seen that yet. And so I guess really before we even see him in the Valley this year, we'll see him again come preseason time, I would imagine, for the Kraken, and we'll kind of see where he's at when it comes to that stuff. And if he's able to hang in there physically, that would go a huge way for me, changing kind of what I think his long-term outlook looks like. I just need to see it first.
That's the thing. We need to see it. And I mean, the way I look at it is, if he's going to succeed, he's going to have to succeed in a way that few other players have found success before. Mm-hmm. Just the style he's going to have to play. And I think that's fun. That would be awesome to see if he can do it. It's just that, my mind thinks, okay, that's less likely because few players have done it before, but that makes it all the more fun if he can make it work.
Yeah. Is he still listed at 153 pounds?
Yeah.
That's,
I believe it.
I
We
believe
just saw
it
him
too.
at Death Camp. I believe it.
I believe it too. That's just like that's a big hurdle to overcome for sure. Now, I think he's got all the skill in the world, and that's a great first step to overcoming it. Let me tell you.
That is true. I mean, being able to score from distance, right? If you're
Yeah,
far enough away and can use that shot from that distance, maybe you don't have to take as much contact.
exactly. All right. So that's answering that question there. On to Quentin Byfield, RJ. As we're only 20 minutes into this podcast. Oh boy.
Oh man.
Who got to talk for the next 40 minutes on this one, RJ? Quentin Byfield signs an extension with the Kings. Quentin Byfield is their young centerman. They took second overall back in the 2020 draft. And kind of a rough start to his career, dealing with the COVID delays that existed for him at the OHL level when he was drafted. He had some injury issues while he was playing with the Ontario Reign in the AHL, but he really showed up in a big way kind of for the Kings this past season with 55 points in 80 games, 20 goals. Looked very good for them. 4 assists in 5 games in the playoffs too. In the first round for them, and the Kings rewarded him with a nice little. It's a contract extension, RJ. Would you call this a bridge deal? Because it kind of is, even though it's 5 years in term.
I don't think you can, because it takes him to UFA. It takes him unrestricted free agency, so I just don't think it can qualify as a bridge deal.
That's fair. That is fair. They signed him to a 5-year extension with a cap hit of $6.25 million. It is 5 years. It's going to take him until he is, just about 27, and he will become a UFA. I saw this, RJ. We talked about it in relation to the Kings and why it makes sense for them on the Red Glare, but with the Kraken having to negotiate an extension with Matty Beniers right now, I mean, this seems like a pretty good model that they could potentially follow. Like, if they wanted to get a little bit of term, keep a cap hit sort of low, this would be a way of doing it. The question is, should they?
Right. And I don't think you want to do that in this case. I mean, with Byfield, we talked about this a little bit on the Red Glare podcast and what this contract means for the Kings and for Byfield. But they've basically, I think this is bad for them from a value standpoint, because essentially you've almost walked him directly to unrestricted free agency, which is what you don't want to do,
right,
as far as long-term value, right? But you still get 5 years at what will be at $6.25 million, a complete bargain for Quentin Byfield over those next 5 years. He's going to be a way more valuable player than that for you. And so you get him at that lower cap hit. But when the time comes, he's going to be 26 hitting unrestricted free agency and will have to get massively, massively paid.
Right.
And so it really depends on, I guess, what you think the player is going to turn into. And this is where I worry about it in Byfield's case, where he has, I think, star scoring potential, right? He can be an absolute star 1C. That size and skill combination is rare as far as what he can bring. I guess it depends. What do you think Matty Beniers turns into? And I know we've commented on this in the past. I know we have our opinions that honestly could change after this season, but you have to kind of make a call on it right now. What do you think Matty Beniers is? Because the upside of signing him to a deal like this, especially after a down year, is that you could lock in a pretty low number, because what you're giving up is having him go almost straight to UFA, right?
Right.
To hit UFA at a young age. And that's something that you are giving to the player that benefits the player. And in return, you could get that cap hit. I feel like pretty darn low on Matty Beniers if you offered him a 5-year deal. If you
think so.
Walked him to UFA, right?
Yeah. I think you'd get less than 6.25.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I think you could certainly get
like
less than 6.25.
Yeah, like 5.5 even would be like such a steal, right? So it's really interesting, and it's interesting too because you're talking about two players that actually kind of comp each other in experience pretty well, right? They're both former second overall picks, so they both have that in common, and they both have in common the kind of inconsistent NHL production. They both have had a 55-point season. They both had other seasons that were not that good. Now, the one thing you could say in Byfield's favor is each year he has gotten better, whereas Matty Beniers kind of, so far for his NHL career peaked in his first full season and then took a step back this past season. So that's maybe more concerning for some people versus the Byfield model of just continually getting better. But still, neither guy has totally broken out. Neither guy has shown a lot of consistency at the NHL level where they have just kind of definitively said, this is who I am. You can bank on this. This is my floor. We're moving forward. And so I think that also complicates something like this. And that's why it was so weird to see the 5-year term right to UFA from the Kings in this Byfield deal, because you generally don't see that for players that have not totally shown you definitively who they are going to be at the NHL level. I still think I would rather give up a slightly higher cap hit, but only do a 2 or 3 year deal with Matty Beniers. I just think that's fine, or sign him to the same cap hit of 6.25 if you can, but have it only be a 2 or 3 year deal. Get him some more time at the NHL level. Let him figure out who he's going to be there. And then before you commit long term and you have to deal with the prospect of UFA years, you kind of have an idea as an organization of where he's going to slot in definitively long term for you.
Yeah, I'm with you on that in the case of Matty Beniers. The other difference I see where this could work out for LA, but I don't see Seattle being in that same position, is that really what you're doing is you're sacrificing value down the road after those 5 years for value in these next 5 years. And now for LA, that makes sense because they feel like they're solidly in their window.
Yeah.
Like this is their chance. This is when like Kopitar is still young enough. Doughty's still young enough to be okay, right? They're in their window now. And I think 5 or more years down the road, those guys are going to be gone and out of the league, and you're going to have to kind of retool some things. The Kraken, they're not in that same position. Like they are not in a potentially competing window right now for a Stanley Cup. We're not talking Stanley Cup for next season, right? We're talking about when the prospects like that we talked about, Rakoff, Firkus, Patton, when they're up, that's kind of when the real peak of their window is. And that might be, more than 5 years down the line, or that might extend to at least more than 5 years down the line. And so that's why I don't think that value proposition really makes sense for the Kraken in the same way it does for the Kings.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, I mean, I don't know how ultimately do you think this contract ends up affecting the Matty Beniers extension? Like if you're Matty's camp, are you looking at this? Because we've talked about it from the team side of things. If you're Matty, are you looking at this and you got to love the idea of just getting walked to UFA? Like that's pretty sweet. That's pretty solid. If you're Matty's camp, do you come back to the negotiating table after seeing this and say, hey, what about this? Like maybe we haven't talked about doing something like this. Are you interested, Ron?
I would.
Yeah.
If I was his camp, I would absolutely do that. I think most players would probably be interested in something like that are in a situation like Beniers or Byfield, where you've got to believe in yourself, right? You got to think I'm a second overall pick. I'm going to be a star player. And the sooner you can get to free agency, the better. And usually that kind of deal is reserved for guys with crazy amounts of leverage, like say an Austin Matthews, who was able to walk himself right to UFA and get those huge deals. But most players aren't really able to do that because they don't have the leverage to do it. And I think the Byfield contract is really notable because, I mean, look, he's good, but he's not Austin Matthews.
Right.
But that a player like that was able to get a deal like that for himself at still a pretty reasonable number too.
Yeah. 6.25 for a guy who just put up 55 points. Like that's pretty good.
Right. So he was able to do that. And so I would think any player in that situation should want that deal. Just most teams wouldn't agree to it. And I don't think the Kraken should agree to it. But the Kings were in this kind of weird position where you can kind of justify it because you need to compete right now. You're cap strapped. You need every dollar you can get for right now. And so I think they kind of had to bend on that. Mm-hmm. But if you're Seattle, I don't see why you would bend on that and do something like that.
Yeah, it does. It just doesn't make sense. Yeah, it's like I said, there's parallels between them, but the team situation is the big difference, and that's why I don't think we'll see this for Matty Beniers. I still think we're destined for the bridge deal. It's going to be a 2 or 3 year deal. I just don't see any way that it's not.
Right, I agree, and we've mentioned that for I think a few months now, right?
Yeah.
It just makes so much sense that it would be a short deal. And I know we already addressed the question from last week in the mailbag of like how worried should we be about the fact that it hasn't been signed yet. I just think it's worth repeating. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
It will get done. But the fact that it hasn't been done by now makes me think that we're looking at like maybe late August, early September that it gets done.
That's what I was thinking. Just because it didn't feel like I wasn't getting the sense the few times like Ron was asked about it and stuff that they were going too hard at it, that early in the off season. I feel like they felt like they were going to take care of their other business. I got the sense that Matty's camp was maybe in that same boat where it was like, yeah, take care of the other business. We know we've got time. We understand the situation. It's not like there's arb rights on the table. Like, there is no rush on this. And so I don't think either side's going to rush it too much. I guess just to ask the question, RJ, do you think it extends into training camp? Like, do you think there's like a tiny little mini holdout or something where Matty's not there day one?
No, I don't think so. There's no reason that it should. The Kraken have enough money to get a deal done. Matty, it just makes sense that it should be this bridge deal. There's no real impediment.
It benefits both sides.
It does. And also the real problem is if you actually do have to miss some of training camp, because this is a huge year for Matty Beniers.
Yes.
And not just for the team. Obviously, the team is going to rely on him a ton. They need him to kind of turn things around. So that's important, but also just for himself.
Yeah.
Because however much this deal is for, what's really going to matter for Matty Beniers and his earning potential long term is the kind of player that he can turn himself into. Mm-hmm. And that starts with this training camp. Well, it starts with this offseason, really, and the work that he's doing right now to get ready for it. But it really starts with this training camp, and missing time there is the biggest way that things can go wrong for him and for the team.
Yep.
I just don't think either side's going to let it happen. I don't see Matty Beniers as the type of player or person who's going to jeopardize something like that for a little extra money on a short-term bridge deal early in his career.
Yeah. Again, the fact that it benefits both team and player to be looking at a bridge deal means that I can't imagine the argument over money is going to be that difficult. And as you said, the Kraken have the money. Like, it's not like they're right up against the cap where, it's going to be difficult for them. You've got over $8 million in cap, in money right now, in cap space. That's the word I'm looking for. He's not going to cost that much. Like, you're fine. Like,
no, he's not.
You should be able to sign him for like a 5 or whatever at a 5 number or something like that. And still have some wiggle room come trade deadline time or later on in the season. So I really think it's going to be like whenever both sides decide, all right, it's time, let's go ahead and like get this done. I feel like should be a fairly quick and easy process at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, heck, even if you're doing something long-term and getting into the 7-8 number and you're starting to get a crunch along the cap, you just move Tanev.
Exactly. Like, yeah, no, the Kraken have options. You can move Yanni Gourde, you can move Brandon Tanev, you can move one of the defensemen if you really wanted to, if you felt like you could get somebody back there. So yeah, there's options there for them long term, and everything should be fine. But I just think like bridge deal wise, you're going to know definitively in 2 or 3 years what Matty's going to be for you long term. It also gives you the benefit of at that point you'll probably have learned what Shane Wright is going to be for you long term as well, so you can start planning around whatever contract you got to give him. And you might even have a year or two's worth of Berkeley Catton playing for you as well that you can kind of look at and kind of see something from that. So get early inklings about whether or not you're going to have to pony up big dollars for him as well. So, good problems to have potentially down the road for Ron Francis and the Kraken organization, but it does start with just at some point getting something done before training camp. But like I said, why wouldn't they all take a vacation now? And then come back to it in September. Yeah, like why wouldn't you just do this in September? It makes all the sense for both parties. There's no rush.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So that's 34 minutes in. RJ, is that the podcast?
Oh man. Okay. Usually we'll have an emergency kind of break glass type of topic, right?
Yeah.
but I mean,
There's
this week, okay, what can we come up with on the spot, Dylan?
on the spot. I mean, there is not too much because the mailbag was so good. Like everybody asked so many good questions. It was so exhaustive. Like anything we could have pulled up, I feel like we ended up talking about last week. You know what I mean? It was
Yeah,
just really
exactly. No,
solid.
the mailbag really does kind of, clean up all those questions.
I'm,
So,
yeah, I'm looking at everything. I can't think of anything. I'm looking at prospects. We answered all the prospect questions last week. Looking at the cap situation, like we talked about, the goaltending situation and all that. I don't know. I think maybe this is just a short but sweet episode.
okay. Okay, actually, Dylan, I have one thing if we
Okay.
want to get into it. All right.
Yes.
So we can look forward to next week's podcast and talk
Yeah.
about favorite moments of the season. Now, I don't want to influence anybody and talk about ours because we'll do that next week.
Yes.
But is there some kind of, because when we talk about that episode, one thing I love about it, we mentioned this earlier, but is that for every game that, like, look, we've all watched the game, we know what happened. There's thousands of perspectives on it, right?
Right.
Every fan has their own perspective. Everybody who was there has their own different perspective. Is there some moment from last season? Now, it's not like Winter Classic because that's too obvious, right? But a moment from last season where you could share kind of your like unique perspective on it that was a little different, or that you were doing something kind of different. Just a story from last season. I'm sorry to put you on the spot maybe for this, but just one that, like, as though you were sharing a story, like the people that
Yeah.
we want to contact us and everything.
I,
I can think of one for myself while
okay.
you
Yeah. Yes. Yes. You
think.
go
Okay.
while I think.
Okay. So I'll start with my story here. And it's actually, it was a game the Kraken played against Daniel Sprong. He got an assist in it, tying back to the start of the podcast. But it was, and I'm looking up the date here. It
October
was
24th, maybe.
Yep, October 24th. Yeah, the Seattle Detroit game, and I feel like some people might mention this as one of the
It's a
moments
good
to
one.
remember last season because it was a great game. Although I wouldn't really know because I still actually haven't seen the game in
Yes.
full, and that's because I was giving a presentation to at one of my old college classes. The professor had invited me to speak, but I was kind of following that game along on my phone, but I was still a little nervous trying to make sure I had everything I was going to say right. And uh, I saw that it looked like the Kraken were going to lose. They had blown a 3-1 lead, and it was now they were down like 4-3 late in the third period. And so I walked into the class thinking, all right, well, it's over. That's a shame. Sorry, Dylan, you got to do this post game for this horrible loss. And then I was talking to the class and I was doing my whole thing about I cover the Kraken. And then somebody mentions, and I said, there's even a Kraken game right now that I'm missing, but Dylan's taking over the post game. And then someone's like, oh yeah, they won. I'm like, what do you mean they won? They won? Like they were trailing with like a minute to go. And they said, yeah. So yeah, told me that, yeah, they tied it with like a minute and a half to go. And then they won in overtime. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. I bet post game is great. So that was, I don't usually find out that way about the result of a Kraken game. Usually I always know as it happens. And so that one was kind of a memorable moment for me. And then also my first thought being, I can't believe I'm missing this post game. They won this game. How am I missing this post game of all of them? So that's definitely a game I'm going to remember from this season.
And little did you know that for that season specifically, that was going to be one of the massive highlights.
I know, one of the top moments. I know.
I'm really trying to think about it. I mean, obviously, only being up there for a handful of games each year, like all of the games I get to go to CPA are special for me. I mean, that'll be different next year, but this year that was still very much the case. So like, I think of, like the Flyers game right before the Winter Classic, just because everybody was there. Anybody who had any, potential reason to be covering the Kraken for the Winter Classic was at that game. So it was the most full that I had ever seen the press bridge. There was lots of people that I, don't normally get to talk to and interact with, and everybody was just so excited for it. So there was already that kind of energy around it. So like that was kind of fun. But again, that's not a great story. I don't know. I mean, all of them are great in their own ways, because a lot of it for me, the experience comes down to like what ends up happening on post game and interacting with the community and stuff. And, even after the really bad games late in the year, they're already out of it. It's post trade deadline, game's bad, all that kind of stuff. We just always end up having fun with everybody. And that's always just kind of what I end up taking away, is that, no matter how bad the season kind of was, I don't think there was ever really a post game that by the end of it I wasn't still like feeling good and smiling and all of that. Like that's always just my big takeaway. But I that's not very like specific. I'm just struggling
No,
to
that's
think.
all
I mean,
right.
like I could talk about sharing M&Ms on the press bridge of in Crypto.com arena with Jeff Baker, newest member of the Kraken organization. So I guess give him a shout out, and I will miss having those moments on the SoCal road trips with Jeff Baker. So like that was always kind of fun, talking about like old hockey cards and sharing M&Ms. That's those are kind of like unique experiences, but. Yeah, so I'll work that in. The congrats to Jeff for joining the Kraken organization.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Congrats to Jeff for joining the Kraken. That's right. You two did have some fun times on those SoCal road trips, sharing M&Ms, talking about old hockey cards. I imagine that was a pretty fun conversation. So there we go. I just wanted to kind of get everyone, lead into the next episode a little bit, get everyone excited about it. If you too have stories of sharing M&Ms and talking about old hockey cards with Jeff Baker somehow, but really just your own, unique perspective on a moment that you have from this last season. That's kind of what we want to hear, and just excited to hear everybody's next week.
Yeah. So low bar to clear for me. There you go.
Yeah, you can do better than
that.
If you can do better than that, which I know you can, then send us what you got.
Exactly. You do better than, well, I really enjoyed the few times I was able to network, RJ. Those are the big highlights for me. The few times I could network with everybody. So there you go. And again, remind everybody where they can reach out to us for that next episode, RJ.
That's right. So you can email us at contact@emeraldcityhockey.com, or you can reach out to us on social media, at Twitter, Instagram, at EmeraldCityHKY.
Yep. And a quick reminder for everybody that August 1st is when the Beer Hall is having that Steinholding competition. So looking forward to that. It's less than 13 days away now.
Start lifting, work out your arms right now.
Get started on it. Remember, it's not about like how much weight you can hold, it's how long you can hold it. It's got to work on stamina training, which is a little bit different there. So looking forward to that, and remind you that the winner of that's going to get 2 round trip tickets to Oktoberfest in New York City with hotel accommodations, and then from there you can go and get a chance to compete in the New York Steinholding competition in Central Park, which is my favorite part of New York, RJ. I will go ahead and say that because it's the only part of New York that has nature. The city.
There you go. It's a solid choice. Now that the Carnegie Deli is closed down, it might be my favorite too.
I should have known you'd go for the food place first and foremost.
Of course.
I'm like, I need trees. I just remember like landing in New York and walking around my first day, and I was just like, you know what I really need right now? I need to see a tree. I kind of need that. I need to touch grass, RJ. I needed to touch grass.
It does not compare to a pastrami sandwich on rye.
Probably not. Thanks everybody for joining us for this one. We'll see you all next time.
Hey everyone, before we go, we just wanted to give a quick shout out to all of our awesome patrons over at patreon.com/emeraldcityhockey, especially our Terror of the Deep patrons.
Thank you so much for making all this possible. We really appreciate your support.